We today I've been looking at the introduction to Lorna Hardwick's 2023 book Reception Studies. And what I thought was interesting is that there's not really a particular moment where Hardwick defines what is reception studies, but the sort of general idea I got from the whole introductory chapter is that reception studies is this study of the two-way relationship between a source text and culture and then a new work and its receiving culture. And I think the terminology being used throughout this article is kind of interesting. I noticed that she generally uses the term text to talk about like a piece of media that's, from the ancient world, or if not a specific piece of media like a text or a specific work of art, we're talking about an aspect of an ancient culture that's being received, right? That's the text. And then the work or the reception is those are the terms being used to refer to the specific examples of classical reception, which you might note I'm just going to abbreviate as CR a few times in the slides. I'm sorry that there are so many words on the page. I feel like I'm a very wordy person, but hopefully we'll have this, potentially as a reference people can look at later. But again, so this idea of the two-way relationship between source text and culture and a new work and its receiving culture. And one of the key takeaways I had from this article was how much Hardwick really rejects this idea that reception studies only yields insights into the receiving society, right? Like she says, yes, of course it does that, but it also focuses critical attention back towards the ancient source, right? Sometimes by framing new questions that haven't been asked yet, or retrieving aspects of the source which have been marginalized or forgotten, right? So I think there has been this sort of critique of reception studies as being something that only, again, generates insights into the receiving culture. But Hardwick very much pushes back against that, again, has this idea of it being a two-way relationship. So this one quote I thought was great from page 5, where she states that reception studies, therefore, is concerned not only with individual texts and their relationship with one another, but also the broader cultural processes which shape and make up those relationships, right? I feel, again, everyone had such when I was reading the bios of everyone attending this meeting, I was so blown away by how much, like, it's really a beautiful diversity of people from all around the world and at different parts of their career, and I'm sure with different interests in exactly what type of reception we're all interested in. But perhaps maybe this is not true, but I'm thinking a universal might be that we're not just interested in the what is the reception, but the why is the reception. I feel like that's kind of a driving question here, right? Not just what are the differences between an ancient text and its reception, right? But then why did those changes happen? What are the broader, again, cultural processes which are shaping and making up this relationship between source text and reception? So again, that was just one of the general takeaways. I wanted to pause for a little bit and go over this discussion that Hardwick gives on pages 2 and 3 about the classical tradition, right? Since especially some of the people, attendees in the chat, are younger in the field, like undergraduates or early graduate students. At least in my experience as an undergraduate and a grad student, I feel like I very rarely was given a formal training in like the history of the field of classical studies, right? You kind of just, you come into it and you see the state of the field as it is. So I really appreciated how Hardwick had this little commentary on classical scholarship on the classical tradition, right? What that was and how it developed. And so one of the things she states is that this, again, classical scholarship on what is called the classical tradition studied the transmission and dissemination of classical culture through the ages, but it tended to emphasize the influence of classical writers, artists, and thinkers on subsequent intellectual movements and individual works. And something that she is key to point out is the way that this was often prone to notions of elitism, right? Right? It's often implying that ancient texts either have some essential meaning that can be discerned only if someone has the necessary learning, like only if you understand exactly if you have this background and the proper training, then you can truly understand what Aristotle meant or what Homer meant, yada yada, right? And this sort of as a byproduct of this often constructed the notion of some great chain of influence, right? That's linking the great works of the Greeks and Romans to their counterparts in the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment and the Victorian period and modern high culture, right? Again, the idea of this being a very elite process. So master artists and art writers learning from the greats and passing that on through, again, very works of high art, high culture. The reality of this is that it is based on a very narrow range of perspectives that tended to undervalue diversity in both ancient and subsequent cultures. So, in the process of giving this little overview of the history of the classical tradition, she is also presenting this critique, right? And she advocates for moving away from the study of a linear progression of influence. But she does think that there is value in retaining the study of how texts are transmitted, right? How canons are formulated, right? So basically, not saying that we need to accept the classical tradition as it is, as if this is some kind of a neutral concept that just exists as it is in the world, but that this is a concept that was created, right? It's a culturally constructed idea, the idea of the classical canon or the classical tradition. We may not be able to fully escape that history, but we can become aware of it, right? And we can decide how we want to engage with it and where we want to go with it. So, this is all making sense? Apologies if I'm talking really fast. Let me wave your hands if I need to slow down or anything like that. All right, so the next thing I really wanted to focus on was on pages 7 and 8. She lists these three prominent scholars who are all like literary and like critical oh my gosh, literary and cultural theory folks, right? That had an influence on classical reception studies. So I was going to kind of go through these step by step just because these names are very new to me. I don't have a lot of background in these scholars, but I think I understand what she's saying about drawing out the connections between the scholarship of these authors and the connections to her general understanding of theory. But if anyone else has more background knowledge of this, like if I get something wrong, please feel free to put that in the chat and we can discuss it later. And also apologies for my pronunciation of these German names. But the first scholar that she mentions is Hans Robert Joss, who's publishing in the 1960s, and he developed this theory of the aesthetics of reception, right? It concerns the interaction of production and reception, right? Like the dialogue between the producer slash artist and then the reader slash audience slash consumer, right? Basically stating that the receiver's expectations and interpretations of classical reception is going to be shaped by their social and cultural context, and uses this phrase, the horizon of experience of life, right? So your horizon of your experiences, everything that you've experienced, your social and cultural context is going to affect how you interpret and engage with classical reception. Seems kind of straightforward. I feel like I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. The second scholar she mentioned is Wolfgang Iser, who was publishing in the 1970s, and he emphasized this idea of like reader response and the construction of meaning in literary text. So I believe he was one of the literary theorists. It wasn't specifically just talking about classical reception, but that this is very interesting because he focuses on this idea of the actual reader and then the implied reader, right? So the actual reader is the person who is actually engaging, like your actual audience, whoever actually engages with a particular work of classical reception. But the implied reader is the reader to whom the structure and the language of the text speaks, right? So whoever is creating a text, a piece of media, whatever, whoever they think is going to engage with their work and whoever they might subconsciously sort of tailor their work towards, or like who they're speaking to through their work is the implied reader. And then there's, again, the actual reader, the actual person. So both the real and the imaginary, these two different audiences both affect the construction of meaning in a particular literary text. Again, let me know if that makes sense. Checking for understanding. Again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, please. And then the last prominent scholar is Hans-Georg Gadamer, who's publishing in the 1960s and 1970s. And he had this idea, again, that texts do not contain essential meanings that are just waiting to be drawn out by scholars, right? Yeah, but rather that their meaning is constructed. So again, this I feel like connects very well with what she was saying about the classical tradition, the idea that it's not, I feel like there's a lot of ego wrapped up in that idea that, oh, there is an essential meaning that's just waiting to be drawn out by the scholar with the right training, and that's me, right? Like I feel like there's a bit of like a scholarly ego to that idea, right? So again, this scholar is pushing back against that and saying, no, there is no essential meaning. Rather, the meaning attributed to an ancient text is going to be shaped by also the historical impact of its subsequent receptions, right? So the idea that it is impossible for us to get in a mental time machine and go back in time and understand, again, Homer the way that Homer intended it to be understood in his world. Now, our understanding of Homer is always going to be impacted by everyone else's understanding of Homer that's come before us, right? That again, there is no going back to the world as it once was. You can only engage with the world as it is. And there's a distance here, which the word distance, keep in mind, because the idea of critical distance is something I was going to talk about later. But there's also this whole list of working vocabulary words that she lays out and gives the definitions for. I didn't want to go through all the definitions just yet, but if anyone had any particular words that they were confused about or wanted to discuss the definition of, again, please feel free to put that in the chat. I'm going to pause here for a minute to give folks a chance to write if they need, and also to ask, are there any questions so far in the chat? Anything we should go over? Laura, is there anything? I haven't actually looked at the chat.
Nothing yet.
Okay. Okay. Let me scroll down so I can actually see everyone's. Are we good to move on, or do we want a minute to stay paused here? No, good to move on? Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so after this, on pages 10 and 11, Hardwick lays out again these key assumptions such as about classical reception studies. So I was going to work through those step by step. Number one is just that receptions affect perceptions of the ancient world. I feel like this seems pretty straightforward to me, right? The idea that, again, we can't go back in time and understand the ancient world as it was. We can only understand the distance between us, right? And every reception of everyone who's ever come before us is going to affect our perception of the ancient world. Assumption number two is the idea that receptions within antiquity also need to be interrogated as the same way as like subsequent receptions. So introducing again this idea that people in the ancient world, people in antiquity were also participating in the reception of people who came before them, right? And that is something that can be studied and should not necessarily be privileged or thought of as fundamentally different from the way that we in our contemporary world engage with reception. Number three is that we must look closely at both the source text and context, and again, the receiving text and context. And this is where I wanted to bring up that term critical distance, right? Really, she kind of talks about it more on page 8, but my understanding from this, and again, I want to see if anyone else had a different understanding or a different mental working definition of the term critical distance. But my understanding is that it's by recognizing, again, the distance in time, place, and culture between ancient and modern versions of a text. By recognizing that, we are enabled to, more critically perceive our own cultural horizons, right? That in recognizing that distance, we are able in some ways to stand. She describes this sort of like you stand almost outside yourself, and you can see that by recognizing the distance between you and another time period, a different culture, right? You can recognize your own cultural horizons. And maybe this idea of cultural horizons, that was number 4. Cultural horizons, right? Again, this is another phrase that she uses, which I believe are the assumption of a receiver's particular social and cultural context. Again, building off the theoretical groundwork of Joss, right, and his concept of the reader's horizon of experience of life, right? So your cultural horizons are the expectations and the assumptions that you might have because of your unique social and cultural context. And that by recognizing the critical distance between you and the source text or the ancient culture you are receiving or engaging with, you may become more aware of your own cultural horizons. Yeah. Number 5 is this idea that reception practice and analysis reveals both commonalities and differences between ancient and modern cultures. Right? Makes sense. Number 6 is that classical reception is valuable beyond classical studies, right? As an index of cultural continuity and change. So again, the idea that this is not just some insular theoretical practice that only is relevant to this particular field, but that this is something that can be applied to all humanities fields or anything that's studying cultural continuity and change. Classical reception has a stake there. And then this last one, number 7, I honestly was a little bit thrown off by the way that this was phrased, but I believe the sentence is again speaking to the idea of like the stakes of classical reception. But the direct quote is that reception is and always has been a field for the practice and study of contest about values and their relationship to knowledge and power. So again, I was a little thrown off by the use of the word contest here. So I'm curious again when we get to in the chat or during the Q&A and whatnot later, if anyone has thoughts about exactly what she means by the study of contest about values and whatnot. But I think it is thinking about how this the study we're doing I feel like implicitly we're all gonna there's certain value statements and judgments embedded in any kind of cultural analysis work, right? And so that is again part of the stakes of classical reception. What are we really saying? Like, what is the potentially maybe like a political or a social or cultural critique that could be coming out of this reception? Again, that's just how I took it, but I'm curious to know what you guys think. Yeah, I'll think for a second here because this is again a lot of text going through these key assumptions. And I believe the last thing we were going to review was just this idea of like, okay, how do we take this theory and how do we turn it into a thinking routine? Like, how do we apply this to our research, right? So the quotes that we were picking at here, this is on page 5, where she goes through these 3 different sort of steps or things like a kind of questions about to ask about the reception itself. The first one is just that the artistic or intellectual processes involved in selecting, imitating, or adapting ancient works, right? We ask ourselves, how is the text received or refigured by an artist, a writer, or a designer? And then we're thinking also about how the later work relates to the source, kind of turning this sort of theory into just a very, very general, very basic open-ended question of, again, how is a text received or refigured? This is kind of like the first step we might engage in when doing classical reception studies, right? Again, the how and the what. What is the reception? What is the source cultural aspect of the source text being received? And then how is it being received and refigured, right? So as a very, very basic, maybe familiar example to work through, Disney's Hercules, right? If we're taking this as our piece of reception to analyze and we're applying that very first question of like, how is the text received or reconfigured, we can think about ancient myths about Hercules, ancient art depicting Hercules, and then straight up compare how is that same myth, that story being represented in this particular movie, right? So here in this vase, we have Hercules fighting the Hydra, and then here in the movie, if we were asking again, how is the text refigured, we can be asking, how did they visually choose to represent this monster? Like the proportions of size are different, or the color, and how does this fight work out? In the Disney movie, it's just Hercules on his own. In the vase, and oftentimes in the myth, he has someone who helps him, right? So those are, again, how we could apply that question to this particular piece, right? The second step in this thinking routine, the quote that we take is the relationship between this process and the context which it takes place, right? So we're thinking now about context. These contexts could include the receiver's knowledge of the source and how this knowledge was obtained. We could be thinking about the writer or the artist's work as a whole. We could be thinking about the collaboration between writer and translator, or like director and designer and actor. We could be thinking about the role of patron or financier, or the role of the audience slash reader slash public, again, both actual and imagined. And again, to kind of put that all together into a big question, the question that comes out of this is, again, what is the context in which the text is received, right? And again, all these different factors outside of just the ancient source, right? All these things contribute to its reception and sometimes can introduce new dimensions. So that would be the questions we then ask. Once we establish what is the reception, how is the reception, what is the context in which the reception is received? So in the case of Disney's Hercules, right? This is a movie directed by John Musker and Ron Clements, right? It is an American movie. It's being created by the Disney Corporation, right? These are, again, ideas of who's financing the project, who is directing the project, who are the creatives behind it. And again, when we're thinking about the audience, we might think about this is a movie for children, right? This is also a movie that Disney wants to merchandise to children through toys and costumes. All of those different cultural contexts could be avenues of investigation for our reception work, right? And then finally, the third theory to thinking routine bit is that she asks, okay, what is the purpose or the function for which the new work or appropriation of ideas and values is made, right? For instance, is it being used as an authority to legitimate something or someone, right? Both in the present, whether political, artistic, social, educational, or cultural in a very broad sense. Again, this goes basically from the what or the how to the what's the context, and now what is the purpose or the function of this reception, right? What implicit or explicit messages might it be sending? So in the case of Disney's Hercules, its function is to be entertainment, like children's and families' entertainment. Its function is to be part of this huge body of work that Disney has. That so it's both art, but it's also very much tied up into the very capitalist nature of Disney as making products that it thinks once it will be marketable, right? That it can then make money off of and add to its huge vault of animated family films. So yeah, that was again, here's a little theory to thinking routine. Very much clearly laid out. This is something that we were hoping could be, for some of us, again, this is going to be very basic. Like we do this all the time. We are so used to this idea of this thinking routine. It's almost instinctual, but we wanted to lay it out very clearly, again, for folks who are new or for in the case that maybe we've been doing it, but we hadn't really thought about what we were doing. But just the idea, how is a text received or figured? What is the context in which this text is received? And then what is the purpose or function of these receptions? This is the guiding questions that can lead us through our research and help structure it for the future. So when we go to breakout rooms, we were going to ask each of us to kind of talk about what is a work, a piece of media that we've been thinking about recently, that we've either published on or worked on before, or that we're thinking about pursuing in the future. How do these questions apply to that work? But before we do that, question time. Thank you so much for listening to me talk so long. I hope it all made sense.